Good evening. Welcome to our second conversation on the right relationship with money, sponsored by the Greater Shiloh Stewardship Education Ministry. Tonight, our conversation centers on women, work, and money, a historical perspective. In this conversation, we will examine the change in women's employment during the 20th century and the social and economic challenges that women as workers face, even now in the 21st century. The major topics for consideration tonight will be the evolution of women in the labor force, the transition of women into professional jobs and jobs traditionally held by men, the current status of women, work, and money, the social and economic challenges facing women in the 21st century. We'll talk about concepts such as gender discrimination, the feminization of work, the glass ceiling, the glass escalator, and gender pay equity. To get our conversation started, Shawana Barnes will come and talk to us about the history of women and work and money. She will provide for us some historical facts about this issue.
Hey, beautiful. Here we go. I wanted to take some time to give you the bigger picture of women and money and history. Because what happened in the past is still having an impact on what's happening in the present, for you, for me, and for women everywhere. Why? Because I think it's mostly because I think it's interesting, but I also think it's helpful to get things in context, to get some perspective on what's what. So we're going to just run through a brief quiz, and of course I'm going to give you the answers as well, but let's just jump right in. So in what year do you suppose it was that a woman in the world could first have her own bank account? I'm going to say in the modern world. I don't know, some other. The first year a woman could have her own bank account. It was in 1881. That's over 100 years ago in France. But it was another 5 years before a married woman could have her own bank account. Think about that. Think about how you control, you control your money. Think about how we take for granted some of these awesome experiences. I don't know if they, maybe that's when they really did keep the money in the shoebox or in the mattress or buried in the backyard. It wasn't until the 60s that the U.S. allowed women to have their own account, and it wasn't until 75 until you could in the UK. All right, get warmed up here. What year do you suppose it was that a woman could first have her own credit card or apply for credit, right? So again, maybe you think, well, in 1881, who cares? But I'm saying to you, it has strongly impacted where we are now and how we view this. So the first year women in the United States can have their own credit card was 1974. Before then, if a woman wanted a credit card, she had to bring a spouse, she had to bring a man with her to co-sign. And this, keep in mind, was regardless of the woman's income to get credit. What I'm saying is, I really feel like that puts a damper on how women perceive their own ability to manage money. In what year do you suppose it was guaranteed that a woman could not be fired because she was pregnant? Fired because she was pregnant. Can you imagine, especially as a single woman? In what year do you suppose in the United States it was no longer legal to fire a woman because she was pregnant? 1978. That's really recent. So you go 78, 88, 98, 2008, 2018. It's only been 40 years. And we know women have been having babies for way longer than that. In what year do you suppose it was that health insurance was the same cost for men as it was for women? Because prior to this year, it cost more to pay women, had to pay more to have insurance, health insurance, than men. What year? Yeah, 2010. So this is a tricky one for me, because in a sense I can understand why that happened, because my guess is because of pregnancy, there's women's expenses on medical insurance are a little higher, but that may not be true. So I can understand how some of these laws got into place. One of my favorites, just for fun, 1976 was the first year that an Irish woman could go into an English pub and use her own money and get service, because otherwise she was going to be refused. That's 1976. When an Irish woman could first use not somebody else's, her own money, and then get schnockered or whatever in that situation. It was in I'll let you guess. When we got to this place in the United States where it was no longer legal to change the title of a job in order to pay a woman less. It's within my lifetime. In what year did it become illegal to change a woman's job title so that you could pay her less? You'd leave the men's at, junior associate, and then you maybe make the woman's a clerk. 1970. I want to make sure I got all the good ones. I did. That's what I want you to know. So as we move forward in this wild wealth quest, as we become wild wealth creators, it's important to know where we've come from. It's important to know the history. So share some of these cool facts with some people that you know. And I will see you soon. Again, this is Shauna Barnes, Wild Wealth Quest. Go wild.
The historical evolution of women in the labor force can be divided into 3 different phases. There are 3 periods of women's participation in the labor force during the 20th century. Phase 1 extends from 1900 to 1930. The entry of women into the workforce in the United States has been a major contributor to the prosperity of this country. However, at the beginning of the 20th century, most women did not work outside of the home. During that time, approximately 20% of women worked outside of the home. These women were usually young and single. About 5% of all married women worked outside of the home. Please understand that this underestimates the contribution that these women actually made to the economy. They were responsible for childcare, as well as other domestic responsibilities of the home. These married women also participated in family businesses that involved the production and the sale of goods. African American women were 2 times more likely to work and more likely to remain in the labor force, even after marriage. Occupational choices for women during this time were limited. Most were not educated, and they, as a result, were forced to work manual labor. They worked in factories or they worked as domestic workers. Women who were widowed, divorced, or abandoned were forced to work, especially if they had underage children. These women were low-skilled and low-paid service workers. Black women were often at the very bottom of the employment ladder. Race discrimination, as well as gender discrimination, deepened their problems and created more disadvantages. There were only 2% of women enrolled in higher education during this period. They were able to take the professional positions that were available. The small percentage of women who did work in professional occupations were teachers, nurses, or clerical workers. The majority were white women, with a smaller percentage being immigrant and Black women. In the early 1900s, almost 3/4 of all teachers were women. As more and more women entered the labor force, there was what is called the feminization of the labor force. As women entered the labor force, they were often segregated into gender jobs, such as clerical work, childcare, and caring for the elderly, hospital work, and domestic work. These jobs were characterized by lower pay than men's jobs, poor working conditions, and fewer opportunities for promotion and advancement. Even the educational system prepared girls to assume domestic duties. As we look at this period, we want to highlight some of the historical events and people that characterized this period. By 1900, every state had enacted a piece of legislation known as the Married Women's Property Act. This act gave married women a degree of control over their own income and their property. In 1905, Madam C.J. Walker, a Black woman, became the first self-made millionaire. And I'm sure that some of you listening to me have used her products in the past, or hair products in the past. The passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 gave women the right to vote. In 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment was drafted. In phase two, that period lasted from 1930 to 1970. The number of married women now entering the labor force started to increase. Increases were the result of two major things. There were more women completing high school, and there was a greater need for clerical workers. Women lost jobs in the 1930s because of the Great Depression. To protect the jobs of male heads of households, many states passed laws that discriminated against the employment of married women. The Economy Act of 1932 prohibited the government from employing more than one person per family. As a result of this legislation that discriminated against women workers, particularly married workers, over 2 million women lost their jobs. Women and Black workers struggled because the government and the general public as well viewed workers largely as white men. There were policies also enacted to establish the lower minimum wage for women workers. Between 1945 and 1950, women in the labor force increased by 50%, largely as a result of men serving in the military during World War II. The passage of the Equal Pay Act and the Civil Rights Act strengthened protections from discrimination for women. The Equal Pay Act ended differences for people working in the same place of employment, doing the same job. It prohibited employers from discriminating against workers on the basis of sex, race, religion, and national origin. Phase 3 encompasses the period from the 1970s to the present. Labor force participation by women between the ages of 25 to 54 continued to increase significantly. In the 1970s, women in that age group constituted 62% of the labor force. By the 1990s, 74% of women in that age group were employed. The higher courts, particularly the federal courts, the U.S. Court of Appeals, and the United States Supreme Court, granted rights and protections to women workers. Selected high court decisions affected workplace rights and accomplished a number of things. One, these rulings struck down company policies that segregated jobs based on gender. Secondly, they prohibited companies from changing job titles to avoid paying women equal to their male counterparts. Job titles were often changed for women to pay them much less for doing similar work to men. And this was brought up by Ms. Barnes in her Wild West quest. These decisions also forbade employer policies that prohibited the hiring of mothers with preschool-age children. They banned discrimination against women for pregnancy and childbirth reasons. And finally, they granted the right to apply for credit, granted women the right to apply for credit in their own names. The numbers of women going into traditional jobs, teaching, nursing, social work, clerical work, all declined. Women started to move into professional jobs that were traditionally held by men. Women went to medical school and became doctors. They went to law school and became lawyers. They went to graduate school and became university professors. They entered industry in management. The wage gap between the wages for men and women still existed, but at that time they started to decrease. We look at Black women and labor force participation. When compared to other women's participation in the labor market, Black women have always had the highest labor participation rates. This is true despite age, marital status, or age of children at home. Black women have historically worked in low-paying domestic jobs that involved cooking, cleaning, and taking care of children for white families. In the 1970s, when women started to enter the labor force, Black women were excluded from better-paying jobs and were overrepresented in service jobs. Because of the intersection of race and gender, women of color still, to this day, experience different and unequal outcomes as members of the labor force. Women of color in the labor force continue to experience economic and occupational disadvantages as a result of both racism and sexism. Black women make 64 cents for every dollar that men make. Latina women fare even worse. They make 54 cents for every dollar that men make. Women of color experience limited leadership opportunities. Often in the workplace, they experience sexual harassment. They're subjected often to persistent doubts about their intelligence, their skills, and competency. More recently, we have recognized microaggressions in the workplace. Microaggressions are verbal, nonverbal, racist, or sexist comments. Microaggressions communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative comments to target people based solely on their marginalized group membership. Microaggressions are often based on negative stereotypes and biases about a marginalized group. In this next clip, a Black woman talks about microaggressions that occur in the workplace.
So I talk to people a lot about establishing a diverse and inclusive work environment and creating a culture where people feel free to be themselves, to take up space, I say, right? When I use the word take up space, I mean, if you feel passionate about a topic, you can have big gestures and be a woman or be a person of color, or, you know, have a quiver in your voice and be a woman and not have to worry about all of the stereotypes and assumptions that will be made on you based on your gender or your race or your religious background. You can take up space and be exactly who you are, free from all of the baggage associated with the stereotypes affixed to who you are. When people use coded language about why certain groups of people can access certain resources and other folks that have concerns about other folks accessing those resources, they're usually playing into the stereotypes that are affixed to your group that you're a member of. So for me, as a Black woman, I'm angry, emotional, volatile, tardy, right? Lazy, sometimes criminal, loud, brazen. I mean, there are many, many, many stereotypes that are associated with me just based on the skin that I have, based on the gender that I was born with. Those things exist. This is not an extreme example. The loaded language associated with it is, I had a conversation with Cyrilda and I was afraid. I'm afraid to go and have a conversation with Cyrilda. If I tell Cyrilda that I don't like what she did in her, in her presentation, she's gonna lash out at me. That's loaded language. Where is that coming from? Has she demonstrated that she's actually gonna do anything of that nature? Or is it just because she's got big gestures? Is it just because she's got an afro that automatically elicits fear in you? Those things manifest into policy. Those feelings manifest into rules and regulations that are oppressive to people like me. And I can give you a million of those examples, but they happen all day long. And human resources has got to be charged with interrupting that, digging deeper, asking questions like, has she ever demonstrated that if you give her feedback, she's going to lash out? Has she ever demonstrated that if she works from home, she doesn't work at all? HR has got to facilitate the deeper dive into what's happening inside the person who owns and harbors those assumptions and biases. And they also got to facilitate the coming together of the two people who are from different cultures, different backgrounds, different genders, to explore where the rub is, where the discomfort is. Because if you, the person who's in power, are uncomfortable with that individual, there's probably some discomfort on the side of the person who doesn't have any power when it comes to relating to you.
For many years, women encountered doors that were closed to the labor force. As doors started to open and women went in, they started to assume positions with higher salaries, higher prestige, higher status. But many of these jobs also brought challenges. Opportunities to achieve brought challenges, some old, resurgence of old challenges, but also some new challenges in the 21st century. So what we have seen in terms of challenges in the 21st century include declining labor force participation. Women's participation in the labor force reached a peak at 78%. Since 2000, we have seen a decline in labor force participation for both men and women. It has been on a decline much faster for women than for men. Labor force participation for women fell from 78% to 74%. Workers are not participating in the labor force. And researchers have discovered that it may be one of two reasons. They've left the labor force, they're not employed or even looking for work. Many are unemployed due to layoffs, downsizing of corporations and businesses, just the COVID-19 COVID-19 resulted in a lot of unemployment for workers. The greatest decline has been since 2020, when women aged 20 and over started to leave the labor force in record numbers. Since February 2020, over 2.3 million women have left the labor force. Reasons for the decline in women's labor force participation include expensive childcare. 10 million working women are mothers with young children. Childcare is so expensive that working moms' salaries are not enough to cover those costs. It is more affordable for families if one parent stays home with the children than to pay for childcare. Another reason that we see decline is work-life balance. Balancing work and family is a major problem for women workers. Many women may work in positions that require long hours. Women may be penalized for taking time off for family matters. Sociologists have coined the term called the second shift. It is a term that they use to describe the social burden on women who are working outside of the home, but then must go home and take care of childcare and housework. Working women have domestic responsibilities after they get home from the job world. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild conducted a study and found that only 20% of husbands share household work equally with women. Also, women have little leisure time, on average 15 hours per week less than their husbands. Stress and burnout, another major cause of women leaving the workforce. Even before COVID, many women were leaving the workforce due to stress and burnout. During the pandemic, not many companies and organizations, less than 1/3, adjusted their performance review expectations to account for the challenges caused by the pandemic. Workers were still expected to meet their pre-pandemic productivity expectations. And then finally, we look at COVID-19 related reasons. Many of these trends in job losses and women leaving the workforce were in existence way before COVID-19. COVID-19 made the situation much worse. During this period, women experienced unemployment and job layoffs due to closing businesses, school and daycare closures that caused her to remain at home to take care of children. And then the double shift, which increased the load for mothers who were more likely than fathers to be responsible for housework and caregiving during the pandemic. Wage disparities. Although the wage gap between the earnings of men and women has narrowed, women working full-time still earn 17% per week less than men. Even when we compare men and women in the same or similar occupations with the same education, background, and experience, there's still a 10% gap in wages. Salary negotiations and how bonuses are awarded are biased against the women. There is no difference in how often men and women ask for raises. However, studies show that men are more likely to be successful in getting a raise than women. So then the question is, why the continued pay gap in the 21st century? Some have argued that it's because women choose lower paying careers. Secondly, there's still gender discrimination and the child penalty. Women miss work and work experience while they care for children. Finally, men started out with higher salaries than women after graduating from college. We cannot ignore that there are gender-related impediments that hold women back, including discrimination, attitudes that reduce women's success in the workplace, and women don't have the mentors that many men have. There are limited opportunities for upward mobility. Getting the same opportunities as men to achieve and attain higher positions is a major challenge for women. Research has shown that although women enter graduate school and professional schools in numbers that are equal to men, they're still less likely to reach the highest levels of their professions. Men are expected to develop into a leadership position, but women must demonstrate that they are capable of leadership even before being considered for a leadership position. Women's ability to lead is often undermined by biases and stereotypes. A study by Kinsey and Associates revealed that when being considered for leadership position, only 16% of men had to provide more than required evidence of competency, while 31% of white women and 42% of Black women reported having to provide evidence of competency. So we see that Black women experience both a gender discrimination and race discrimination. Then we have the glass ceiling. The glass ceiling describes an invisible barrier that women face in trying to reach upper level positions. Researchers find that women often are not in positions such as marketing and sales and production from which top executives are often recruited. Rather, they are steered into human resources and public relations, where their work is not appreciated to the same degree because it does not bring in profits for the organization. Women often lack mentors. Male executives are reluctant to mentor them because they fear gossip and sexual harassment charges, or because they see women as being weak. And then we still have in place the good old boy networks. Good old boy networks refer to the social relationships that occur within any large organization. Discrimination is often the unintended consequence of these good old boy networks. Then we have a new phenomenon called the glass escalator. This is a recent phenomenon where men have begun to move into female-dominated jobs, teaching, nursing, social work. Men see these positions as providing financial security and stability. Since 2000, there's been an interest and an increase in the number of men moving into these positions. Women have historically faced access and advancement obstacles. Initially, they were denied access to the labor force, doors closed. Once in the labor force and entering male-dominated professions, they encountered another obstacle, the glass ceiling. Now we see that the glass escalator becomes another obstacle in the upward mobility of women in the workplace. In female-dominated professions, women climb the ladder to achieve leadership roles. Men in female-dominated professions glide past women on the invisible escalator to achieve senior-level positions. While the percentages of men in female-dominated positions and professions may be smaller, they are promoted faster to senior-level positions, receive more promotions, are paid higher salaries than men. We strive to achieve gender equity in the workplace. This next clip gives us insight into the importance and the significance of achieving gender equity in the workplace.
All around the world, women want to work and get paid for it, and the majority of men agree. But there's a gap between women's aspirations and the realities of the labor market. Women are less likely to participate in the labor market. They face lower chances of finding a job. They're paid less than men, more likely to be in involuntary part-time work, and they're subject to discrimination in the workplace. Traditional gender roles are slow to change. In every country, women do at least twice as much housework and care work at home than men, unpaid. When paid and unpaid work is combined, women work longer days than men. Around the world, women and men agree. Balancing work and family responsibilities, including lack of access to affordable care services, is the major challenge to women at work. The opportunity? Recognizing, rewarding, reducing, and redistributing care work, and creating more decent care jobs for women and men. More than 1 of every 3 women worldwide has experienced physical or sexual violence. Violence against women does not only have physical, emotional, and psychological costs, it has a significant impact on national economies. Violence, harassment, and discrimination can prevent women from entering and staying in the job market, particularly in male-dominated fields. The global pay gap between men and women is estimated at 23%. In some countries, women earn just 60% of what men earn for an hour of the same work. Differences in education, experience, age, and career breaks cannot entirely explain why. The significant difference is discrimination against women, direct or indirect. The Women at Work Centenary and the Future of Work Centenary initiatives provide an opportunity not only to make the obstacles to decent work for women visible, but to also spell out the action needed to overcome them. The deliberate and bold choices we make will ensure a future of work with gender equality at its heart. Major pathways towards achieving gender equality and decent work include expanding the provision of accessible and high-quality care services and creating decent jobs in the care economy. Laws and mechanisms to ensure equal pay for work of equal value. And extend social protection coverage. Ending violence and harassment in the world of work. And macroeconomic policies that foster job-rich growth and address structural gender inequalities. This transformation is essential if we want to see gender equality at the heart of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and make decent work for women and men a reality.
Thank you for viewing this presentation on the historical overview of women's participation in the labor force. Join us again in August 17th, when the conversation continues as we look at strategies for achieving financial stability and prosperity. If you have questions, please contact Ms. Shirley Davis, Ministry Leader for the Stewardship Education Ministry. We will have those questions answered in our December meeting. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.